Are we ready? All right. Hello, everyone, and thanks for your time today. Thanks for attending this session called Scaling Regional and Domestic Finance for Regenerative Agriculture and Sustainable Forestry in Africa. We know, before we introduce the panelists, we know that Africa holds a quarter of global biodiversity and a majority of the world's remaining arable land, yet receives a tiny share of global climate and nature finance. And regulatory and market pressures, CSRD, deforestation-free supply chains, TNFD, nature-related risk expectations, all of those are changing the way global capital looks at land use. So I'd like to pose a question just to you all to keep in mind as we go through the panel discussion today. What would it take for Africa's domestic financial systems to become the primary engine for capital for regenerative agriculture and sustainable forestry, rather than a dependency on sporadic international projects? So hold that question in your mind as we go through the panel discussion today. By the end of the session, I hope that we've all made clear why regenerative agriculture and sustainable forestry in Africa are now systemically material for global food security, climate and supply chain resilience. That we've pointed out the structural barriers blocking capital flows through African financial systems into regenerative, especially regenerative and nature-positive value chains. And we'll explore Regen Africa as well with Dorothy as a practical solution architecture and identify where different capital providers and corporates can plug in, hopefully folks like you in the room. And then we'll try and surface north-south partnership opportunities and expectations from the Davos Lodge audience that can shape Regen's design and early pipeline. So we have with us today, we have Dr. Naoko Ishii. She is, Special Presidential Envoy for Global Commons and Professor and Director of the Center for Global Commons at the University of Tokyo. Thanks for joining us. Then we have Jessica Smith, Head of Nature and Head of Academic Engagement at the United Nations Environment Program's Finance Initiative, among other things. You can introduce yourself in more detail if you'd like. And then Dorothy Maseke, here in the middle. She's the head of African Natural Capital Alliance, or ANCA Secretariat, and Africa Lead for Nature Finance and TNFD at FSD Africa. Thank you all for joining us today. Maybe we'll start with talking about why this matters, why it matters now. Maybe Naoko, we might start with you. From the perspective of the global commons, why is Africa's land use transition not just a regional issue, but a global systemic risk and opportunity?
Thank you so much for having me. Let me ask the audience, how many of you know planetary boundary concept? Okay. Good. Because otherwise I have to start explaining that how it is. Well, planetary boundary concept is developed by natural Earth system scientists. It's more than 2 decades ago. That it really shows us that what is our relationship with natural system. And it actually identified 9 important Earth planet function and the system which support our even civilization. But when that scientists kind of chase that where we are for each of the 9 planetary boundaries, they realize and they tell us that we have exceeded 7 out of 9 planetary boundaries, which does include climate change, biodiversity loss, and then land use change, the water, ocean, and the fertilizer, almost everything we can think of. And then it tells us we are really at a very critical stage of our humanity, that we have actually eroded the foundation of our civilization. And it's not just Africa, it's actually entirely global. But the important point is that Africa is actually much less to have impacts, the bad impacts of the natural system, but we were very much, we are very much affected by this global symptom. So that we have a very strong stake to find out how we can come back to these planetary boundaries together with allies in the global sphere. And you can imagine today that we discuss about also the agriculture. That if you think about agriculture impacts, it's not only climate change, but because that we actually emit a lot of GHG through this agriculture, so the climate change impact, but also biodiversity loss. It's huge in Africa because that your biodiversity is actually going into the very dangerous situation very quickly, and mostly because of also the land use change, and then the land use, of course, then water. In case of Africa, it may be still a lot of local issue, but it's all very much connected. But if some of you are in Berlin in COP30, we announced that the 3 basins, one lifeline, 3 basins is the Amazon, that the Congo, and Indonesia or the Southeast Asia. Those 3 basins have a lifeline, and they are all connected. So it's an African challenge, but it's also a global challenge. It's a global challenge, also African challenge. So that's why this the Africa has a very strong stake in the global issue. The global issue also needs to take care of Africa. Then agriculture, if we discuss it, it's really sitting at the heart of this issue.
Yeah, thank you. I'm struck by what you said, because I think one of the things we think a lot about, especially myself in my role as Senior Research Impact Fellow at the University of Exeter in the UK, focused on food systems, and the nature and climate impact team that I work on, is how do we finance this? How do we pay for it, right? We know what we need to do. We know who needs to be involved, and then how do we pay for it? And so I wonder if we can maybe turn to Jessica. UNEP's FI convenes over 500 financial institutions globally, and you've co-developed the Finance for Nature project, Finance for Nature positive framework that provides a working model for financial institutions. So what are you seeing in terms of their readiness to finance regenerative agriculture and sustainable forestry in Africa, and maybe what's missing?
Great, thank you so much, Josh. And thanks for having me on the panel. Yes, so we have around 550 financial institutions, mainly banks and insurers in our platform. And UNEP overall has published the State of Finance for Forests recently, timed with the Berlin COP. And we have identified there is a $216 billion gap in forest finance. However, the amount of harmful subsidies going into the forest sector is actually 400 billion. So we should add those two together. We need to redirect that 400 and then find a further 200. And our Finance for Nature Positive framework that we've developed with the Finance for Biodiversity Foundation and will now be built out with partners including the Global Environment Facility and WWF, tackles exactly this type of challenge for financing. So for the majority of financial institutions, the harmful things that they are financing in nature-related sectors will be much larger. So we need to start there in terms of a cascade of, first of all, stopping financing the most harmful activities, then starting to use that finance to redirect into transition activities. Look for solutions, but we are really discouraging investing in solutions if you're not looking at the cumulative impact in your entire portfolio. And then our final level is around the coherence of your portfolio. So we work with particularly banks right now on setting targets across their entire portfolios for nature, including forests. And that's where we can start to identify new capital. So there is a ton of capital out there. The fact that there is money flowing constantly all the time, that's not the problem. The problem is directing it into the right things. So over the next 2 years, we will be building out this framework, including the forest-related elements. And it is extremely important. We do have a good number of members across the entire African continent, including the Congo Basin. And the majority, and I think Dorothy will probably speak to this as well, the majority of their financial portfolios are heavily exposed to primary industries like forestry. So it is very much the financial institutions that have the least ability to diversify in the economies that they are in who are most exposed to these problems. So, we recognize that there are challenges, but we do need to encourage those financial institutions to start moving towards looking for these opportunities. And I think the focus of the panel in terms of looking for domestic and regional finance is really key, but international financial institutions can play a bigger role in terms of using those domestic and regional institutions as financial intermediaries for global capital.
Excellent segue to talk a bit more about domestic options. So given this global to local picture, let's get concrete about financing bottlenecks and how a program like Regen Africa is trying to solve them. So Regen Africa is a new FSD Africa program to mobilize domestic capital for regenerative land use. How is that being done in practice, Dorothy?
Great. So I work for FSD Africa. It's a specialist development agency. Our role is actually to make finance work for Africa's future. We focus on climate, we focus on nature, and within the focus on nature, we set up the African Natural Capital Alliance, which is a multi-stakeholder body that brings together financial institutions, project developers, policymakers, civil society, all who have made certain commitments towards financing of nature. We currently have a number of financial institutions with around 130 institutions currently very active within the membership. Now, as we have been engaging with these financial institutions and project developers, we note that there are 4 main challenges that we need to overcome to finance nature, to finance, in this particular case, any regenerative practices, including sustainable forestry practices. Policy is one. You can do everything else, but if the policies do not work, and the government the subsidies that, Jessica, I'm sure you'll talk about, work against what we're doing, then we are all not going to succeed. Data and metrics is another. And this is because in whatever that we're doing, we speak to investors and we are convincing investors that this is where they should put their money and this is where domestic capital should flow. This is where, global capital should flow. But without track record, without data, without, aspects that they can without impact measures, which some of them are very concerned about, then it becomes a big challenge. So we're also addressing the data and metrics challenge. Capacity is another. And many times we actually assume that all of us understand terms like sustainable or regenerative, and it's shocking when you talk to financial institutions and they ask you, what do you mean by sustainable forestry? We have been lending towards inputs, farm inputs. We don't know of any other, and we don't really see why we need to lend to any other sustainable practices. So the capacity building component is also quite important. And then the other thing is pipeline generation and investment catalyzation. And this is where whatever it is that we are doing, if you work on the policy, you have the data sorted, you work on the metrics, and you work on investments, and where are these investments or where is this money meant to flow to? And so the pipeline piece and the aspect on investment catalyzation comes out very strongly. But now I want to link this to what you're asking specifically, and I have some data based on why we are setting up this Regen platform or Regen, fund. And this is very simple. Many of you, and I think I was talking to Jason, and he reminded me that 65% of the world's arable land is actually in Africa. We look at, and these are real figures, agriculture employs 60% of our workforce. 70% of sub-Saharan Africans actually rely directly on forests and woodlands. That's a these are real data. And then we now look at how natural capital is being eroded. We are looking at 60% of sub-Saharan Africa's farmland already degraded. 25% of our countries are already experiencing water stress. And then now let's look at the financial or economic aspect of it. About 3% of an annual GDP decline is directly related to soil depletion, soil erosion and nutrient depletion. and then 5% decline of equity value for agriculture under certain exposed portfolios. Now, when you look at all these figures, there's a real reason for us to actually look at sustainable, regenerative agriculture and sustainable forestry. The economic realities are there. The economic resilience needs are there. Regenerative systems, according to research by CGIAR, indicate that 10 to 20% higher net margins through yield stability and lower input costs. And so when you look at the financial reason why it is important for institutions, financial institutions, to start supporting, to start lending to, or insurance companies to develop products that support sustainable forestry, regenerative agriculture, honestly, Josh, there's no reason why this should not be done. And so our Regen Agriculture program, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, once that question comes through, attempts to address this particular challenge.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm curious, we mentioned how critical Africa is to the planet, and then we also mentioned how far the shortfall is in terms of investment. I'm wondering, maybe Naoko, we can start with you and then maybe give you a chance to talk about frameworks. But where are the blind spots in global climate and nature finance architecture when it comes to channeling these resources through local financial systems rather than bypassing them?
Yeah, before I want to talk about the blind spot, I also want to go a little deeper about why we have this program that Dorothy very eloquently explained about your capital work. And actually we were working very much together with natural capital, that how to put the valuation of the natural capital on the balance sheet, meaning to put it not just the natural capital accounting, but how to recognize the nature as an economic asset or investable asset to be recognized by financial institutions. Right now, the challenge is our current existing system, even accounting system, doesn't count for the full value of natural capital. And that's why the economic activities which invest in nature is not really well recognized, so it's not really rewarded. So that unless we find a way to shift this valuation system so that the entire economic system, not only financial institutions, recognize that the real value of the natural capital, we continue to struggle that how to get the finance into the right place. So your work, Dorothy, that the African Natural Capital Alliance is very powerful instrument that how to recognize it as an economic asset. And actually I'm also working on this initiative called Nature on the Balance Sheet initiative. That is more or less the same thing. How to shift this entire market system, that not only financial institution, but the entire market system to recognize natural capital as a investable asset. And it's going to be more like a system coordination of the investors, but then rating agency, the regulatory system, the, of course, accounting system, and also we need to go to even the central banks or Ministry of Finance who kind of regulate or impact this and how the financial market or the economic market works. So it's going to be a system coordination project. It's a very long-term project, but this is one way to completely shift this current problem of world doesn't recognize the natural capital. By the way, it's not only natural capital, human capital, societal capital, not really recognized well. But to me, this and how to do this natural capital is the most important thing, knowing we don't have much time before we transform our economic system within these planetary boundaries. So that's what I want to focus on. Then it's not only that it's a global problem, but it's also the African problem, because as previous speaker mentioned, that Africa has such an important value of the natural capital, and then because you are not able to recognize it economically, you continue to be in the very disadvantaged status in the international capital market. You can imagine how the international financial system, valuation system recognize African natural capital. Your investment grade will completely change for positive. So that's kind of one way to think about it. One spotlight, the blind spot or something I feel quite excited at the Berlin is finally some of the African finance ministers get that message. They are interested in recognizing investment in resilience, including degraded land, as a benefit because it's a long-term investment, and they will see the reward of doing that. So I want to continue to work with those people who recognize that and the value of natural capital, not just verbally, but also on their book. So that's something we should do for this years to come.
Yeah, great. We've heard about getting nature on the balance sheet. We've heard about investing in degraded lands. Jessica, you said something in the beginning about subsidies and trying to redirect subsidies. I wonder if maybe you can talk to us about this incentive structure and how it needs to change in order for initiatives like Regen to succeed.
Great, and I just, first of all, want to build a little bit on what Naoka was saying about nature not being sufficiently valued. And I think there's an insufficiency of our accounting, but I think there also has been an insufficiency of understanding the context of how forests are managed in different parts of the world. And there are certainly more opportunities in this space to have intermediation from African financial institutions who better understand the context of how forests are managed in their own countries. And we have been working, for example, through the Agri-3 facility with a guarantee structure on a new loan in Malawi. And I think there's been a lot of lessons in terms of how we can actually bring capital at the right place, at the right scale to such projects, and having the integration between forestry and agriculture is potentially, more of a factor in this region as compared to other regions, and having the understanding through the capital flow process of the importance of that. So just coming back to the question of harmful subsidies, we have been part of the group that originally launched the TNFD or brought the task force together, and now it's grown to now around 700 early adopters around the world. We've been massively impressed by ENCA's work in terms of having training and getting TNFD disclosures across the entire continent, but we do see that there are considerable nature-related risks in the portfolio of financial institutions in Africa, and having more data, more clarity where we can understand these externalities gives us a clearer picture of how those harmful subsidies are moving through the system and creating the perverse incentives. And I would like to give a shout out to our colleagues at BioFin, the UNDP program, who are working in around 136 Global South countries on really getting granular data on where those harmful subsidies are coming from. A lot of them are coming from domestic policy not being harmonized, but some of them are also coming from, for example, international trade policy or other types of international incentives that haven't been set in an integrated way. So there's a lot of opportunity there, and as I mentioned, the State of Finance for Forests has identified that there's multiples more harmful finance in the system. So if we get better clarity and transparency over that, we can very easily close that forest finance gap. And there do seem to be quite a lot of opportunities. We've heard quite a lot from the investment space that the timberland space in terms of having mixed between biodiverse spaces and having more plantation offtake has been a financially successful model. So one of the things that I've learned now in the years working in finance, if something can be demonstrated, it can be replicated, and that's extremely encouraging. And investors will be looking to their peers to find more examples like that around the world. And with the numbers that Dorothy gave, there are certainly huge opportunities. Also referring back to what Naoko said about the wealth and the potential wealth generation, if we are valuing that natural asset, then there is an enormous amount of wealth on the African continent that can be both preserved and benefited from in a self-supporting way.
Great. We've heard about some of the risks, and I really want to know more about the Regen facility. So, Dorothy, how is this Regen investment facility designed to de-risk and crowd in domestic finance? What types of instruments and partnerships with financial institutions are you envisioning?
Yeah, so essentially, it's how we are structuring it, almost just like Agri 3, is that we are going to deploy concessional, it's an on-lending facility that deploys concessional capital through local financial institutions and non-banking financial institutions, essentially to scale transition finance. And many times we forget the role of these non-banking financial institutions. They're a very critical cog in the wheel. We also forget the role of aggregators, who many times, of course, form part of these NBFIs. But these aggregators are cooperative societies. They are unions. They are, in Kenya, we call them chamas, meaning, just a grouping, however loose or however formalized they are. And so what we want to do and what we are doing out of this is to look at both the capital demand side and the capital supply side. Now, what essentially are we planning? How is this going to be structured? The point is, we are crowding in this capital, either junior, mezzanine, or senior debt. And how this will work is that it will enable it's an on-lending facility that enables financial institutions and NBFIs, like I said, to actually work towards supporting farmers and supporting these kind of businesses. We are looking at opportunities for longer tenure loans. We are looking at flexible collateral. Collateral is a big challenge in our case in Africa because of things to do with land tenure, etc. We are looking at extended grace periods for payment of these loans. So that's one arm of this particular facility. The second arm, which I linked to the capacity side, is a technical assistance fund that allows capacity building, capacity training for financial institutions, for NBFIs, but also for the farmers themselves. To look at this in the context of pure regenerative practices. Like I said, regenerative, the term regenerative has many meanings, many definitions. But how do we actually work towards real impact, real natural capital and social capital impacts that we are all working very hard for? And so capabilities to do with monitoring, reporting, and verification. Capabilities to do with underwriting capacity. Whether it's underwriting of the loans or underwriting of insurance products. That's the second component. The third piece is what you said, Jessica, policy. Policy is so important. How can we feed all this into learnings that can actually feed into the data that feeds into policy, so that every single decision that any country makes, then at the end of the day provides the environment that is required to actually support these kind of instruments and these kind of opportunities to actually take full advantage of the natural capital opportunities that we have. Now, what will these three components do? One, it will work on the real investment risks, because we are de-risking, we are providing this opportunity or capacity to develop this de-risking mechanism. It will work on the product mismatch risks, product mismatch challenges, the long tenure or long-term impact or longer-term aspects of regenerative practices. If you're looking at soil health, it's not something you will measure in a year. It may be measured in 2, 3, 4, 5 years. You're looking at sustainable forestry. How does that work in relation to water retention, water quality? Again, almost measured in medium to longer term. So how do you align the lending to these longer term impact aspects that are very critical in any analysis? So it will work on product mismatches. It will also work on the perceived risks, which is a soft element but very important. And that's why the capacity building element is very important. The aspect of sharing stories, the living lab that comes out of all these learnings, learning from Agri 3, learning from Malawi experience, and bringing all this into other markets. And then, of course, on the data side, the policy side, of course, again, still works on both the real risks, but also the perceived risks.
Excellent. So we heard from sort of the capacity needs of financial institutions. I'm wondering, Jessica, if you can tell us a little bit more, maybe from a financial institution's perspective, what does it take for agricultural and forestry enterprises to become, quote, investment ready for local financial institutions? How can an accelerator avoid being just another pilot? What makes those enterprises investment ready?
Great. Well, we've got two categories. We've got one where there is already a client for a bank, for example, and then ones that are, starting fresh with a new relationship. I would like to start with the ones where there is an established relationship, and we do have guidance for our banks for sectors for no regrets actions that they should ask from their clients. And actually, a very interesting finding that we've had is a lot of the clients are actually going beyond in terms of nature, water, climate management than their banks knew about. And actually, they're happy to be asked. So I think there is some work on our side to make sure that banks are asking those questions and that the clients of the bank are rewarded for those actions. So I think that's part of the picture. Second of all, I think we need to work on the readiness of the financial institutions themselves. So we need for them to be able to be more comfortable, as Dorothy said, working with non-banking institutions and aggregators. So working in different parts of the financial space where there are potentially important investments and making sure that the banks themselves are building those relationships and building those ecosystems. I echo also what Dorothy said about perceived risk, because there are a lot of ways to manage risk that include trust, embeddedness, transparency that don't necessarily require a financial de-risking mechanism. There are other ways to de-risk, and this social capital and relationships is a really important part that banks and investors need to get more comfortable with if they want to work, and we were saying that they should, in areas where there are potential agriculture and forestry investments across Africa. Then we do need the financial community to get comfortable with much larger time frames than they have been. And Dorothy mentioned some of the KPIs that we have in the forestry and agricultural space are those that take time. I would like to call out Lucas Walton, who, one of the Walmart grandchildren from Builder's Vision. He's put a lot of money into Regen Ag, and he came out of, what I would say he probably has the right to secrecy in what he invests in, but he spoke to the FT a few months back, and he said, actually, I'm getting great returns in this space, and others should be entering, and I'm telling you this because you may perceive that these are worse investments, and actually I've had a great track record with these investments. So that was very encouraging, and again, this model, if you can show it once, you can copy it. I think that was great of Lucas to do that. And finally, I think I think Dorothy mentioned the smallholder environment in Africa, and there's varying in different countries, but some countries have maybe 80-90% of their land tenure is communal tenure. Other countries have more freehold land, but this is something that if you want to work in agriculture and forestry and conservation, non-timber forest products in Africa, I think it is very important to understand how communal tenure works, how smallholder systems work, and to really go where those stewards of these assets are and really better understand how those assets are being stewarded, how can capital flow in. And there are many organizations who are able to intermediate those relationships, like the aggregators that Dorothy said. So we need financial institutions who are operating internationally to be investing in their own pipeline and to be able to see the big picture of where that could bring them in the future. And really that this is a no regrets avenue. There are financial opportunities, there are social license to operate opportunities. It's really a win-win, and it's a way to diversify your portfolio when you have a long-term investment. We are in turbulent markets. When you have a long-term investment that is outside of the mainstream, and it creates a lot of diversification across your portfolio. So, I think that this is really an argument I wouldn't make a nature argument here. I would make, a financial argument and a diversification argument that more financial institutions should be building their own readiness for such projects. I think I could say more about the capital continuum. And the projects that are coming along on the capital continuum, we definitely need, philanthropy and really brave early stage investors like Builders Vision in this space. But I do think the mainstream finance space needs to also take that step forward as well.
Yeah. Great. I think now is a great time to ask about the African Bioeconomy Finance Hub. Dorothy, can you just give a brief introduction to what that is?
Yes. So the African Bioeconomy Finance Hub essentially is, I'm using the same term, a hub that looks at, again, these 4 aspects or 4 challenges which provide opportunities. The aspect on policy, the aspect on capacity, the aspect on data and metrics, and investment catalyzation. Still purposefully, directly on the bioeconomy, which essentially refers to the use of biological resources to create economic value. So what does this hub do? It's bringing together all these 4 components, creating a platform where we can, as a continent, derive as much value from our biological resources. I want to give you a statistic that may shock some of you. Africa only retains less than 9% of its biological value within the continent. Most of it is taken out, and even what is taken out, exported, we don't get the real value of what essentially it should be. So the hub is seeking very ambitiously to retain at least 50% of this value within the continent, where we can add value to our products, add value to the raw materials, and even if we export the raw materials, get real value for what these raw materials are. That's what the hub is meant to do.
Excellent. Can you state that percentage one more time?
Less than 10%. Actually, 9%.
9%.
Yes.
So we're almost out of time, but I'm curious, Nayoko, if you could help us better understand why we should embed this G20 endorsed, I might add, African Bioeconomy Finance Hub. How can that create the data and the standards and the policy coherence and all the things that we've already heard about needed for scale, including alignment with TNFD and all these other global frameworks? How does that help us scale? Thoughts?
Well, these 4 components coming together really help us break the fundamental trap we are in. Because we need to really address those barriers, systemic barriers together, and these 4 are extremely needed. But let's think about that. Africa may be the most disadvantaged with those problems, but because of that, the stake is higher, and they can really be a leader, of the very heroic leader, to break those stalements. I was very excited about this Africa hub, because I hear a lot of voices from African leaders. Now it's time for us to take the lead to break this some kind of international rule. It's called international, but mostly provided by Western, culture, Western leaders. But if the African leaders can really stand up and tell us to the international community, what do we do right? Then that it helps not only Africa, but also the entire globe. That's why I am very much excited about it. And the region really can be a very good concrete vehicle to break those barriers. So I'm very much interested in how it will be developed.
Yeah, me too. I'm just cognizant of time. To each of you, in 1 minute, if we get this right, what do we need from the audience to help us get this right? 1 minute, ready, set, go. Whoever's ready.
Let me start.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll get 2 minutes. Policymakers, and it starts with what Jessica said. Can you reform rules that penalize regenerative models? That's very simple. For investors, allocate this much needed capital. But then also, can you also back pipeline? Not necessarily only project, because you need the pipeline to get the projects going.
I'm happy
Okay, because you said penalize, I want to take the other side. I want to see the policy reform to reward the good deed. Penalizing the bad deed is one thing, but we need to really create a system which reward the good deed, meaning investment in natural capital. Without that, we continue to degrade natural capital. That's my worry. And coming from also Ministry of Finance, we all know how difficult it is to repurpose some of the subsidies. It doesn't really work too well on the ground if you are in the middle of politics. So I much prefer to create the incentive side so that everybody could be excited about it. So that's my call, and then I rely on you.
Great. Well, I would say if anyone has ever played the FT game where you try to keep the economy within net zero, it is almost impossible if we keep along the current trajectory. So I would say the first thing is we need vast amounts of creativity and innovation to rethink the way we do things, rethink sectors that don't even exist today. And actually, we're at the end of the month going to do a webinar on investing in fungi, which it's out of the blue, but these are the new horizons we need to look at. The second one is if we have resilience, that's based on diversity, on biological diversity and on cultural diversity. So what we need to imagine is a beautiful mosaic of local leadership, regional leadership around the world, developing solutions that are relevant to their own environments and that are really kind of building a fabric where we are empowering people to lead the way that is relevant to them. So I think this mosaic approach is really important. And, in some ways, of course, I work for the UN. I believe we do need global cooperation in some respects, but it needs to be matched by superpowering that local level. And if we look around the world where intact nature has been maintained, very many studies suggest that it is where indigenous populations are managing territory. So we do need to empower where there are different worldviews, different ways of thinking, and not try to harmonize everything in the way that we do think, to really leave that room, leave that space for creativity and local leadership.
Great. Well, on that beautiful and excellent point, I think that's a great way to end. And I just want to say thank you to Davos Lodge, actually, for having us all on the panel. And thank you for the panelists. They'll be around for a few minutes afterward if you want to talk. We'd love to hear about your innovative approaches and things that we can leverage. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.